Okay, on this second part of our training on estuaries, we're going to talk about the source of fresh water to our estuaries, the river's route to the Texas coast, changes to the quantity as well as the quality of river water before it enters the estuary, and we're going to introduce the freshwater impacts on estuarine ecology. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the excuse me, the alterations in freshwater upland before the water ever gets to the estuary along the coast. First example we have here is changing agricultural practices over the years as farming became more mechanized. Farmers didn't like plowing around wetlands that naturally may have occurred on their properties, so they would drain and ultimately destroy those wetlands to make it easier, increase farmland area as well as make it easier to cultivate with more machinery. Basically, you can see what happens, that historically this red line area defined the drainage into this particular river. As these wetlands were filled, they no longer added capacity for any particular rainfall event in that water that normally would have gone into those wetlands and slowly percolated into the soil was now draining. As you can see, it expanded the drainage area considerably, and so now you get, for the same rainfall, you get much increased watershed flow into the river, which ultimately could result in flooding of the farm property as well as equipment. One of the other negative aspects of this is that these what's pretty much referred to as prairie pothole wetland areas, upland wetland areas, are critical for migratory waterfowl to supply both water and food on their migrations. Okay, this slide depicts one of the most serious upstream pollution problems, and that is what we saw just before on the row crop, and that is excess sediment. See here, a lot of Texas rivers unfortunately look this way. And what does the sediment do? Well, it does several negative things to the water quality. First of all, it blocks the light, just pretty self-explanatory. And when you don't have light, you don't have sufficient light intensity for either planktonic or benthic plants to grow in the water column. That same sediment will fill in little nooks and crannies that had previously provided unique animal habitats, crawfish and so forth. The sediment indirectly reduces dissolved oxygen because you don't have sufficient light, as we said up here, getting into the water column to allow the plants, either suspended or those growing along the edges and the bottom, sufficient light to produce oxygen as they photosynthesize. And sediment can actually be thick enough that it can clog the gills and make it very difficult for fish to get sufficient oxygen to breathe, especially since there's already less oxygen in the river to begin with. And finally, if there is a reservoir on this particular river, this sediment will ultimately drop out largely as it slows down when it gets to that reservoir, and ultimately limit the life expectancy of that particular reservoir as it actually fills in the lake that's formed behind it with sediment. That takes several years, but that's eventually what will happen if sediment continues to pour in. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit now about some of the functions that benefits that freshwater provides to the estuaries we've been talking about. And one of the probably most important first things we want to discuss is the fact that the freshwater coming in and meeting Gulf water, salt water, will form actually a salinity gradient, or we refer to it often as an osmotic gradient. We'll talk about osmosis in a little bit. You can see here three stylized estuaries. Here's an estuary with high river discharge, giving you a majority of the estuary that's pretty much fresh. This would be similar to what we saw up in the north part of Texas, the Sabine Neches, and Galveston to some degree, an estuary that certain parts of it are pretty much fresh at certain times of the year, almost every year. Here's a more typical Texas estuary where you've got a fairly consistent amount of fresh water flowing in from rivers, not a lot of really super heavy rainfalls or even severe droughts. So you get kind of a gradation. Here's 1 part per thousand, 10, 20, 30, 35. And then here's a low discharge to be similar to, say, the Nueces estuary, the Corpus Christi Bay, perhaps even Aransas Bay, where you have a relatively small area that is close to fresh water and grades up pretty rapidly. Here's 10 parts, 20 parts, 30 parts, and Gulf of Mexico, 35 parts per thousand. Osmotic gradients. So these are some of the various salinity gradients you can get in Texas estuaries. One of the second thing that's probably most important as far as freshwater inflow is that that freshwater brings in dissolved nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as a certain amount of decaying plant material referred to as detritus. That's important because estuaries historically have depended on an adequate supply of these nutrients to feed the algae or the plant-like material at the base of the food chain that the entire ecosystem depends on. And I will say that in most cases, if you have an aquatic saline or estuarine system, that system is going to be limited in its primary production by the amount of nitrogen available. If it's a freshwater system, it's primarily going to be limited by the amount of phosphorus coming into the system. The third, so you can see here, phosphorus limited, nitrogen limited. The third benefit is that you're going to have a certain amount of sediment, even though sometimes it's more than you want, but a certain amount of sediment coming into the estuary is a good thing because it, when that sediment-laden freshwater mixes with salt water, the clay particles will flocculate and settle out and form either little deltas, or they will add to the shoreline, raising its elevation a little bit so that you can either maintain or increase the proper elevation for this emergent vegetation that you see right here, such as Spartina, we're going to talk about a little later. Okay, we're going to do a quick little review of some chemistry here because it leads into a physiological function of the marine life, fish in particular, that we're going to see in the next slide. And I want to make the distinction between osmosis, which is the movement of fluid, in most cases water, through a semi-permeable membrane, and diffusion, which is the movement of both fluid as well as solutes. Solutes, in this case, we're going to call this sodium chloride, which is the most common constituent in seawater, a common salt. So you say one of these is sodium, one of these is chloride. And basically what happens is osmosis, being just the movement of fluid, this fluid wants to move through this membrane so that the distribution or the concentration of solutes in the fluid is the same on both sides, which is what's happening here. And as you can see, since just the fluid is moving, the level of the fluid moves from higher on this side, and now it's higher on this side. Diffusion, on the other hand, you got both the ions, in this case sodium chloride, moving, as well as the fluid going the other way. And again, the same thing happens. The concentration wants to be the same on both sides. There's actually a pressure gradient that's set up, and so the fluid moves from this direction here, and the solute moves this way, and you end up with an even distribution, even concentration on both sides, and no change in the water level. Okay, the reason we went through the little chemistry lesson is to explain why the salinity gradient that we described earlier, that's set up in estuaries, is so important to the survival of fish. Again, most marine fish have extremely small eggs and larvae that are often measured in millimeters, not inches. And these larval fish, in most instances, are spawned offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. Currents move them in because they're not large enough to actually swim against the current, so they're part of the plankton. They'll move into the estuaries, and once they get in the estuaries and are big enough to swim, plus the currents are not perhaps as strong there, they will actually try to seek out a salinity in the estuary that kind of matches or close to matches their internal salinity. The larval fishes, again, being so tiny, have an incompletely developed kidney system, and they become stressed when the external salinity varies greatly, either above or below their internal salinity. So, and you might like to know that freshwater fish and saltwater fish have bodily fluid, blood, and plasma salinities that are similar. Freshwater about 10 parts per thousand, but they're living, of course, in 0 parts per thousand medium. Saltwater fish, salinity about 15, but they're living in a medium that's more than twice their salinity at 35 parts per thousand. So again, the estuary is going to be somewhere between the in some certain locations in the estuary is going to be between 10 and 15 or around 15 parts per thousand, which for saltwater fish is ideal. So you can see in these diagrams here what happens in freshwater fish. Real quickly, of course, what happens is because the external salinity medium is much lower in salinity than their internal body fluid, they're trying to actively take up certain ions, chloride ions, for example, through their gills. They're going to actually, even though they've got a mucus and an intact skin integument, they're still going to get water absorption through the skin because, again, the salt content is higher inside here than it is outside. To get rid of that extra water that they're taking in, they first of all drink very little water and excrete a very dilute urine. Again, the fish we're concerned about, talking about our estuaries, are the saltwater fish, where just the opposite happens. They drink a lot of water, but they have to get rid of the ions in that water. So instead of trying to uptake ions through the gills, they're excreting it through the gills. and instead of excreting a lot of dilute urine, they excrete a very concentrated urine. So they have to have very well-developed and active kidneys, which, as we said earlier, they don't have. So they really want to be in an area where they're kind of balanced as far as the external salinity and their internal salinity of about 15 parts per thousand. Okay, you may recall earlier I talked about one of the benefits of freshwater entering the estuaries was the fact that it brought a certain amount of suspended clay particles into the estuary, which contributed to either delta formation or, more importantly, raise the elevation of the estuary to so that particularly emergent plants, Spartina in particular, had the proper elevation to grow around the edges of the estuary. And I just want to show you quickly here what happened. I think you saw that earlier slide of the freshwater coming in and becoming relatively clear pretty quickly. Basically what happens here is that clay particles remain suspended in freshwater due to both the velocity of the river water as well as each of them having a negative surface charge, which cause them to repel each other. Like charges, remember, repel. So you can see here negatively charged clay particles repelling each other. Here's the delta. In seawater, calcium in particular, but also magnesium and aluminum ions will in fact displace hydrated sodium ions, which you can see here. Here's the sodium, here's the water, here's the clay. It'll displace those clay particles, and even though they're still negatively charged, once that gets those hydrated sodium gets displaced by one of these other ions, say calcium, these clay particles will get closer together, and even though they're negatively charged on the surface, there's a physical attraction called van der Waals attraction, which will allow them to actually bind together and increase, obviously, in their density. Now, instead of 3 individuals, you got basically one lump of clay here. Plus, the estuary typically has less water movement than a faster flowing river, so the combination of that allows the clay particles to settle out. Another benefit of estuaries is their ability to remove contaminants from the water by both plant absorption and organism assimilation into their bodies, thus reducing the waste load that would perhaps be entering into the oceans. It's referred to as the assimilative capacity of estuaries. Again, very, very unique to that particular system. However, you can have too much of a good thing. As we mentioned before, one of the benefits of freshwater coming into estuaries was the contribution of nitrogen and phosphorus into the estuary. But you can have too much of a good thing, and excessive nutrient loading results in what we call eutrophication, eu meaning well, troph, fed. So this is a system that's basically overfed with nutrients, and it can result in dense phytoplankton blooms, which result in low dissolved oxygen. You might think, well, phytoplankton blooms or phytoplankton produce oxygen, how does that result in low oxygen? Well, you can actually get such a dense phytoplankton bloom just in the very surface waters of an estuary in particular that has excess nutrient loading. We're going to talk about more in a little bit, to the extent that the bloom actually shades the rest of the phytoplankton in the water column. The extra oxygen being produced right there at the surface goes off into the atmosphere. The rest of the phytoplankton in the water column, again, is not getting enough sunlight to photosynthesize, so It is respiring, and both the surface as well as the lower now non-photosynthesizing algae are constantly respiring, and at night you can end up with a extremely low, if not lethal, dissolved oxygen concentration in the water column, leading to the death of a variety of organisms that require dissolved oxygen to survive. We're going to talk a little bit about three unique habitats found in Gulf Coast estuaries now: oyster reefs, seagrass meadows, and Spartina grass. Oyster, seagrass, Spartina. Here are the three most common seagrasses that we have in Texas. Seagrasses are, as I mentioned before, one of the three kind of unique habitats that we have in Texas estuaries, and they're critical in that not only do they provide primary productivity in form of plant material, which either is consumed directly, or the epiphytes, the microscopic organisms growing on the blades, are grazed on by all kinds of critters. As they die and decompose, they form what's referred to as detritus, which basically is a slow release fertilizer, if you will, kind of the ideal fertilizer for Texas bays. Also, detritus is consumed by several marine organisms. So these are the most common ones in Texas: shoal grass, haliduli. This is one of the most common grasses throughout all of the estuaries. It has a wide salinity range. Turtle grass is very distinct. It has the widest blades. It likes a higher salinity bay, and you find almost all of the turtle grass in Texas estuaries down in the Laguna Madre, where you have much higher salinity, as we've already discussed. And then there's manatee grass, which is kind of an intermediate salinity, climax meaning a final species that you get. Has round blades, fed on by manatees in Florida. We don't have manatees here in Texas unless they escaped from Florida, somehow got over here. I know we've had them here occasionally. We're not sure how they get here. Submerged seagrass meadows are actually a critical habitat for larval fish, larval and juvenile fish, crabs, and shrimp. They not only form shelter, but again, they provide a lot of food for these extremely small organisms as they migrate in from the Gulf of Mexico, and they feed on the what's referred to as the epiphytes, both plants and animals growing on these blades of grass. Again, these occur in fairly dense beds in the estuaries. Typically, you're going to find seagrasses in the estuary, but on the Gulf end, or the Gulf side of the estuary, inside the barrier island, but typically, yeah, not next to the land mass itself, just because the water clarity there is usually much better and allows sufficient light for these grasses to grow. So you can see from this slide that the Texas seagrasses in Texas aren't doing real well. Have percent of seagrass acreage that's remaining. This is from 1999 paper, so since 1950, so about 50 years. You see the most developed part of the Texas coast bordering an estuary up in Galveston area. We only have a 1/10% of the seagrass seagrasses that were there back in 1950. Again, not much better in Matagorda, San Antonio, Copano, a little better in Oasis, Upper Laguna Madre, considerably better, but not much development, very little inflow from river, well, no inflow from rivers, and not that much from surrounding land areas. Baffin Bay is pretty low because it's reached such high salinities in quite frequently in the last 50 years. Lower Laguna Madre, of course, is doing the best. It got about 50% of the seagrasses left since 1950, and that's primarily because Lower Laguna Madre, in particular, water stays relatively clear, allowing sufficient light penetration for seagrasses, especially the turtle grass, which we showed earlier, prefers high salinity areas. Got a slide here talking about the most dominant emergent grass around Texas estuaries. It's critical as far as primary productivity and just the amount of organic matter that it produces. It again is tidally inundated, which provides both surface area for epiphytes, like we mentioned before, as well as shelter for really extremely small fish, crabs, and shrimp. Typically grows in kind of what they call monospecific stands. There's not many other plants that have its unique ability to tolerate a variety of salinity conditions. Preferred salinity, again, is 5 to 32 parts per thousand, but it'll tolerate inundations of fresh water and up to 35 parts per thousand. And actually, some of the sediment salinity that it's growing in has been measured up to 50 parts per thousand. So quite a wide range. It does this through some unique mechanisms that are it actually will take up the water, the salt water, through the root system, and then it has the ability, because of these somewhat hollow stems, to actually excrete the salt onto the blades of grass, and that ultimately gets washed off, with a rainfall or an extremely high tide, so it doesn't really interfere with the photosynthesis of the plant. As we mentioned before in the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus cycling slide, this plant thrives by having its root system down in the no oxygen zone, and it's able to grow that way because it actually can oxygenate its roots and its rhizomes by taking in oxygen through the openings in the leaves and letting it diffuse down through the stem and into the root system. If you remove one of these plants very carefully, you'll actually see that the sediment right around each of the little root hairs is kind of brownish, as opposed to the rest of the sediment in the area that'll be black because of the reducing conditions of that sediment. So that's how it manages to survive. Again, as a unique plant, so it does pretty much grow just by itself. Doesn't have any competition for space. It provides structural support to soft soil, which facilitates burrowing, particularly by the fiddler crabs. Mostly wherever you find Spartina grasses growing around the edge of a body of water, estuarine body of water, you'll find fiddler crabs excavating burrows, which actually increase the soil drainage and provide a little bit of oxygen into the sediment as the oxygenated water drains into that soil. And again, you'll you'll be quite aware of this when you guys head out to the field. It's everywhere, and thank goodness that it is. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of the non-biological but important economic advantages of our Texas estuaries, and that's the fact that they float boats, float barges basically. You see a picture here of the part of the intercoastal waterway canal system that runs usually a mile or so just inside the barrier islands that we discussed earlier. And as they traverse the Texas coast, they of course run through or right along the edges of our 7 estuaries, which become part of that vital waterway. Again, they're about 14 feet deep. It's primarily barge traffic, and again, it's was installed so that goods could be moved very cheaply by water. You can see over here the relative efficiency as far as ton miles per gallon of fuel used. By far, the moving things by water is the most cost-effective way to do it relative to trains, trucks, or especially airplanes. So basically, it's a vital economic link in our economy, especially the Texas economy that's dependent heavily on petroleum products, which get moved up and down the intercoastal waterway. There's one environmental downside is that even though these are only 14 feet deep, they do occasionally require maintenance dredging, which results in a certain amount of turbidity and suspended sediment, which blocks light and smothers benthic organisms. But again, the studies have shown that those benthic organisms, like most marine organisms, have a planktonic stage, and when they spawn, their larvae will repopulate the newly dredged bottom of the intercoastal waterway with no significant biological damage.